From the CISO Series, it's Cybersecurity Headlines.
Insurers should stop funding ransomware payments, says Newberger. Harvard students create Meta Ray-Ban mod that IDs people in seconds, and Salt Typhoon attack potentially exposes wiretap data. These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have selected from this past week's cybersecurity headlines, like a trip to a cheese shop. We always like, oh, that's some nice sharp cheddar. Oh, there's some Wensleydale over there. You know, that Limburger, let's leave it alone. And now we are ready for some insight, opinion, and expertise from our guest, Quincy Castro, the CISO over at Redis. Quincy, thank you so much for making the time. I know this is a last minute thing, so thank you so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I will say, as someone who lives near the Wisconsin border, let me tell you, there are some great cheese shops that to be gone to around here. So love that analogy.
The veritable cybersecurity dells is where we are visiting today. So before we get too deep into all things lactic and otherwise, Quincy, I have to ask, how was your week in cybersecurity?
I mean, ask any CISO that question, right? But no, things are really good. We have a great team over at Redis, and we've been grinding away, doing our thing, and it's been good.
That's what I like to hear. I also like to hear that we have a sponsor for today, and that's Vanta, compliance that doesn't suck too much. Remember, you can join us on YouTube Live. I already see our chat room blowing up. I see a cat giving a wave. I see David Cross. I see CCL. I'm doing Romper Room now. I did not mean to do that, but I realized halfway through it. I'm seeing all these fun people here. Thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't joined us for the live show, we're on at 3:30 every single Friday. Come on over to YouTube or head over to the events page at CISOseries.com. Find the Weekend Review show. Click on it. It is all good, and we'll have a fun time. Before we get into the news of the week, just a quick reminder that all of Quincy's opinions he's about to give are his own, not necessarily those of Redis or any other affiliates. We're happy to have them, and we can't wait to dig in. We got about 20 minutes, so let's jump right into those opinions. First up here, insurers should stop funding ransomware payments, says Newberger. This is an opinion piece written by U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, Ann Newberger, and it was published in the Financial Times. It called for the practice to end, stating that some insurance company policies, for example, covering reimbursement of ransomware payments, incentivize payment of ransoms that fuel the cybercrime ecosystem. She added that the insurance industry could play a constructive role by requiring and verifying implementation of effective cybersecurity measures as a condition of underwriting its policies, akin to the way fire alarm systems are required for home insurance. There is some precedent, I guess, in the insurance industry for this. Quincy, her message followed the 4th annual International Counter Ransomware Initiative Summit, one of my top 3 summits, that was held in Washington, D.C. this past week. We've had this discussion on the show before. Basically, we hear this argument increasingly of paying the ransom. Hey, this is just the cost of doing business. Is there the case here? We could collectively turn off the taps to the bad actors and show them ransomware is not worth it. I'm curious, what's your take on this?
Yeah. So first I'll say I have a ton of respect for Ann Newberger and what she's trying to do. This is a really challenging issue to take on, right? And I think when we think about this topic, the first thing we say is, look, we don't want to blame the victims, right? And the people, the companies that are targeted by ransomware operators are victims, even if as CISOs, we might look at some of these and say, I'm not sure that the kind of practices I would want to see are being followed there. At the same time, I think what we've seen in our industries is there's this moral hazard element to what happens, where you have firms that are not sufficiently investing in security, then they're turning around and insuring themselves against the consequences of that underinvestment, and that fuels this cycle of breaches and data loss. And as a society, not necessarily as individual companies, as a society and citizens in a society, everybody pays the price of that. And this year especially, I think we've seen some huge breaches, some huge incidents that have led to really societal wide impact. And so what do we do, right? And I think this is one of the places where the US government can play a very constructive role in shaping incentives for private industry, in promulgating regulations that will help improve the bar and kind of raise everybody up a little bit here, though. We talked a little bit about insurers taking the front seat on this. And that is a place where I think we have some challenges, right? And I'm sure a lot of the listeners out there, like me, have been through those cyber insurance questionnaires and the process around getting that right. And that is a really look, insurers are already trying to do the right thing here. They're already trying to figure out what is the posture of the entities that they are writing policies for. And every year, those questionnaires get a little bit more intrusive. You sort of see the flavor of the day TTPs being reflected in there. And yet we keep having these issues, right? And so while I think trying to influence insurers and put pressure on private industry to figure this out is one way to go about this. It feels like we've been doing that. Insurers do care about not losing money to ransomware operators, and yet this keeps happening. And so I think
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
thinking,
and as always with any of this, the devil is in the details, because I can agree in principle on this as a good idea, but like, sending out static questionnaires, doesn't, also doesn't give the insurance company like full visibility. So then is the solution, how intrusive do we want to make that? Do we need to make that? Like, I understand that that is a bunch of fine gradients that needs to get paid out here. And we do have a lot of agreement from a cat and CCL in the chat here, basically, saying take away the financial incentives. Insurance companies shouldn't be paying out if the companies are not making legitimate efforts to secure the data
yeah,
in the first place. So some really good points there as well. I'm fascinated by how this will, like, how do you operationalize this, right? Like,
yeah,
how do you work this into the business model more so than insurance companies are already doing? David Spark pointed out, that they are, making efforts to do this already. How do you scale that to make it more meaningful and take away that incentive? I am all for that. There's a lot of implementation that I need to see though too.
exactly.
All right, next up here, Harvard students create Meta Ray-Ban mod that IDs people in seconds. The students modded Meta's new smart glasses into a tool they call iX-Ray that uses the glasses to stream video images to Instagram. Faces captured in the images are then sent to a facial recognition app such as Prim Eyes, which matches images to its publicly available database of faces with names and PII. This provides enough information to cross-reference that data using people's search sites to find addresses and more details, potentially even social security numbers in a matter of minutes if you're, in a public data breach or something like that. In addition, all the data that iX-Ray pulls becomes publicly available, thus creating a potential privacy nightmare for pretty much everyone. So, Quincy, some of us have been, I guess, dreaming about this day for years, dreaming, dreading, nightmaring, to pick your poison here, being able to know everything about a person just by looking at them. But most people will rightfully hate this. It was, of course, bound to happen. We have the technology. The time is now. As a security expert, though, what's the first thought that comes to mind when you look at this kind of new development and seeing kind of how relatively trivial it is to productize this?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's surprising to me is people are surprised by this, right? And for everyone that's listening, I'm sure like we all know that the pieces to build this have been in existence for, in some cases a long time. And so
Mhm.
now what you see is like, hey, it's pretty trivial to start to pull these bits and pieces together and come up with something that looks really shocking, but like the underlying data sources are totally out there. I think what's kind of more interesting around this is like with other things we see in the privacy and in the cybersecurity space, technology doesn't always push the absolute frontier of what's possible up. In a lot of cases, it just brings things into the hands of less sophisticated operators, right? And I think this was like back in the day, it was, Metasploit, and people can go in there and they've just got whatever new vulnerability, and people with no knowledge can go out and throw this stuff. And I think there's another version of that, right? Things that were previously only accessible to governments and law enforcement because they had to have these huge, expensive CCTV deployments and analytics and stuff like that. Now it's like, hey, anyone could just hack something like this together and have a pretty good way of going out and doing this. And when powerful technology like this comes into the hands of private companies and individuals, right, like they're in a democratic society like the United States, there's just not the kind of constraints on individual behavior that there is on government behavior, and that maybe should concern people.
Well, and as CCL points out, in such a compact and inconspicuous form factor, it's one thing when you enter into a store, you might think, okay, maybe there's some sort of facial recognition tech I'd like that disclosed, but like, okay, this is the the user agreement I take by entering into this. But
Yeah,
like, I'm just walking on the street, I'm not entering into anything, and I'm exposed to this. Yeah, it's really what's fascinating about this is a lot of people are pointing out in the chat this isn't new tech, and
yeah,
Quincy, you were pointing out roughly the same thing. But there have been a lot of companies that are like, we don't want to get into the legal morass of all of this. Microsoft was very much out in front of being like, we're going to actually back away from a lot of our facial recognition tech
yeah,
until the regulation is set up so that we don't get sued into oblivion. Uh, Bunch of teens hacking together a Meta Ray-Bans thing, they don't care about it,
yeah,
and a lot of other people, can follow those breadcrumbs for sure.
yeah.
All right, next up here, one of the big national stories this week: Salt Typhoon attack potentially exposes wiretap data. The Chinese state-sponsored hacking group Salt Typhoon has reportedly compromised U.S. broadband providers, including AT&T, Verizon, and Lumen Technologies, through systems used for court-authorized wiretapping. According to sources, the hackers gained access not only to these wiretapping systems, but also to general internet traffic flowing through the networks, raising significant national security concerns, I should say so. The breach is believed to be part of a larger intelligence gathering campaign by China, potentially compromising sensitive data. TechCrunch's Zach Whitaker published a piece illustrating that this is a consequence of including legally required backdoors in communications channels, and that's required by the 1994 Communications Assistant for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA. So, Quincy, one of the tactics that's emerged from ATA or APT groups that we've seen over the past, 18 months or so, particularly, is increasingly focusing on embedding or lurking inside systems rather than just the old smash and grab or ransomware situations. Like mold, once it's inside, very difficult to get out. Georgetown law professor Matt Blaze described this kind of attack as inevitable and said CALEA should be regarded as a cautionary tale, not a success story for backdoors. I'm curious, from your perspective, do you see this as a cautionary tale, or are backdoors and other secret systems too valuable to just, say we can never have these?
Yeah, one of the things that struck me when I looked at this is one of those stories where everyone is going to see in it their own concerns, their own like pet issues, and they're going to bring
Mhm.
that to this and see it through that prism. And so if you're somebody who doesn't like the idea of government surveillance at all, you look at this and you say, well, this is a failure of government surveillance and that's why we shouldn't have it. If you're someone that's super concerned about, you know, the rise of China and potential tech adversaries and their ability to operate on US infrastructure, then you see this as like another warning sign that, hey, we've got a serious problem here. I think I look at this and I say, yeah, if you're a super well-funded nation state actor, what do you want? You want persistent access to the infrastructure in the jurisdictions that you care about so that you can get the intelligence that you're charged to go collect. Do I think this is a CALEA problem? No, not really. CALEA gives, according to this article, adversaries a vector into getting, the data they want, right? And if there's a system that's already pre-built to intercept and analyze traffic, why wouldn't you go that pathway? But if it wasn't this, it would be taking over core routers, or it would be some other way of going after the same intelligence that these people are looking for. And so to me, I see this story and I think this is really a story about the sophistication of threat actors that are operating in on the internet and the kinds of techniques that they're able to bring to bear against their adversaries, and we should really think about that as a country and as CISOs at private companies who are charged with keeping these kind of people out of our systems.
I love that idea of this story will reflect where you're coming from on this, and I think it's very easy to get up in arms about people like you said, whose hobby horse is, hey, end-to-end encryption, all the things, or national security always takes precedence, or you get people that are justifiably extraordinarily passionate about stopping things like CSAM and stuff like that, like all of these very legitimate things. It makes it easy to, when you're so invested in them, to see them as black and white, and to see this as, hey, there is some nuance here. It's not necessarily, CALEA didn't mandate the implementation of this, right? Like that implementation clearly problematic and open to that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think that is a fascinating way to look at this. And I'm going to try and keep that kind of in mind going forward when we have these types of stories, because I think that's really valuable. All right, before we move on to our next story for today, I want to spend a few moments with our sponsor, Vanta. As third-party data breaches continue to rise, companies are increasingly vigilant, which means more time spent on manual security reviews. With Vanta questionnaire automation, security and compliance teams can complete security reviews up to 5 times faster, giving you time back to focus on running your security and compliance programs. Over 8,000 global companies like ZoomInfo, Smart Recruiters, and Noibu use Vanta to save time on security reviews. Visit Vanta.com to learn more about questionnaire automation. That's VANTA.com. All right, next up here, White House launches cybersecurity hiring sprint to help fill 500,000 job openings. We all know hiring is near and dear to a CISO's heart. Well, National Cyber Director Harry Coker Jr. unveiled the hiring program as part of an effort to fill a continued gap in cyber technology and AI positions. The program's major emphasis is to reach job candidates without traditional qualifications, things like computer science or engineering backgrounds. It also addresses the significant issues around burnout and job stress due to private sector job cuts, alert fatigue among security operations staff, and regulatory and legal requirements on CISOs and other risk executives at the C-suite. Excuse me. So, Quincy, a cybersecurity hiring sprint to help fill 500,000 job openings, a super aspirational goal. I mean, how far does lowering that bar to entry or opening the eligibility to maybe non-typical candidates? How much does that help make this feasible?
So I've got sort of two aspects of my personality that want to address this, right? And so first, I
Okay.
want to speak to this as like somebody who trained and worked in the federal government cyber workforce, and I'll just say it's an amazing opportunity. I encourage a lot of the interns and people that I mentor, like early career. This is a great place to get your hands dirty and really see some of the best of the best. And I have tremendous respect for the people that do this kind of work. By and large, everyone I worked with was very intelligent, very motivated. So it's a great opportunity. Look, but then as a, private company CISO today, like we also face the same kind of challenges around hiring and bringing in skilled talent. And honestly, like what I would tell the people that are engaged in this effort is you cannot come after these kind of problems in a brute force, like throw money and people at the problem kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's especially today, like we have a lot of opportunities to think about doing stuff differently. And if you go out and look at some of the things that AI is now able to do around code generation, around, analysis of huge volumes of data, being able to process human language and understand what people are writing and come up with recommendations and things like that, there's just a lot of opportunities to bring AI and generative AI technology into this space to eliminate the need for some of the things that were traditionally like not fun grunt work cyber kinds of jobs. And so I think that's going to be really important. I also think finding people with alternative backgrounds and getting people engaged in security that aren't your traditional kind of CS undergrads is probably part of this as well. And keeping people in the federal workforce who maybe were coming out of, enlisted ranks in the military, they've got huge private sector opportunities. Being able to incentivize them to stay within the government and use those military skills in the civilian workforce is also super important. So all of the above, I think, is the right way to come after this, but it can't be the old school kind of way of doing things.
Yeah, and definitely something, it's a conversation we have all the time on Defense in Depth and on CISO Series podcast of, not just how do we, what roles should we, but like the value that kind of diversity of background will like the value that can like quite tangibly provide, whether you're talking about people from more design backgrounds or just any kind of walk of life. That kind of perspective gets you out of this is the way things are done and helps you think outside the box because, and we point this out all the time, the threat actors aren't looking for certs or degrees or anything like that. Like they're just like you're interested, you have curiosity and want to make some money, let's go.
Right. And so much of being good at a lot of these jobs is being curious about things, asking why, wondering why stuff happens and, what happens if I do this and maybe I try this way, And I think some of the people I've met in my career who are the most talented weren't necessarily people who had all of those traditional boxes checked, but they were people that were good critical thinkers who cared about being able to understand the truth and being able to act on it and like being able to perceive reality effectively, and then would go out and ask good questions and just iterate on that. So yeah.
And CCL in our chat has a recommendation: hire fresh grads into the IT or help desk and then move talented ones into cybersecurity. I know we have talked about that in defense in depth episode, and I heartily agree. I think that's a fantastic pipeline. Kind of gets around the entry level question we sometimes stumble over in cybersecurity for sure. All right, next up here, White House prioritizes secure internet routing and using memory-safe languages. Speaking at a recorded future event Wednesday in Washington, D.C., National Cyber Director Harry Coker, he's coming up a lot today, said the White House is focused on securing two foundational aspects of the tech landscape: how information packets are routed across the internet and computer programming language that can be susceptible to memory-related errors. Specifically, he pointed out how the White House is looking at next steps to secure Border Gateway Protocol. That's right. The White House is looking into BGP, including the adoption of security mechanisms known as Resource Public Key Infrastructure, or RPKI, which it plans to have in place in more than 60% of the federal government's advertised IP space by the end of the year. Coker also spoke of shifting from languages like C or C++ to memory-safe ones like Go or Rust. He identified this as a key priority of the Biden administration and a way to avoid known bugs. And this correlates with a Microsoft report from July 2019 that found that more than 70% of vulnerabilities that have been assigned to CVE in a given year are related to memory safety. So, Quincy, is this a good way to go, or maybe too little too late here?
I think it's somewhere in the middle, right? And, on the BGP part, right, I think the US has always been in a challenging position where, this country takes a very open, like industry forward approach to the infrastructure that runs the internet. And as the birthplace of the internet, that's always historically been the way things have operated. I think there's, in that context, a limited amount of things you can just go and force on people, right? But I would also say, I think a lot of the people that I work with in the CISO community see that as generally a good thing, right? That this is an open first network that is self-healing, that is highly available, and it does the things we want it to do. It just doesn't always do it in as secure a way as we would want it to. I know that's probably a massive understatement. Right. And BGP is a great example of that. So, but I think it is time that we start talking about some of these things. And given, that this isn't just a science project anymore, right? That we have a tremendous amount of commerce, a tremendous amount of activity on these networks. There's that old XKCD comic of like everything's built on like some random person's little
maintainer,
GitHub library, right? Like we've got to go after those underpinnings and make them more robust, because if we look out across the globe, there are other countries and other governments with different views on how this stuff should work, who fundamentally do not like the way the United States has governed a lot of this stuff and would much more prefer to move to a model that is, kind of top down authoritarian around the governance of these networks, right? And so I think it's important that we start to lead on some of these things, because if we're not leading, somebody else is, right? Sorry, do you want to say something, or should we?
No,
please. Yeah, I mean, on memory safe programming languages, right? Like at Redis, all of our foundational products are built on C. We're well aware of the challenges of some of these languages. I think, is this the end all be all of things that the US government could do to incentivize building more secure software? I'm not entirely sure. And honestly, I think it's good to use the hammer of government procurement to start to incentivize some of this stuff. But I look back to earlier in the year when like the Office of the White House Cyber Director was coming out with stuff around changing the liability regime for technology vendors. And I think those kind of more general policy moves are more likely to incentivize companies to move in the right direction versus more prescriptive things around languages. You look at what happened with like Midnight Blizzard and some of these other intrusions into cloud providers, right? None of that has to do with memory safe programming. All of that has to do with manipulation of what's essentially black box technology to the buyer to do stuff within those environments that wasn't intended. And as particularly the federal government leans more and more into big, cloud service provider technology and things like that, hey, there's other things that probably need to happen that aren't just telling people which programming languages to write their code in to get those safe outcomes that I think we're all looking for.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's good that we have government officials that can speak to that. I think that is good. But yeah, like to be overly prescriptive with that kind of pigeonholes you, and it risks appearing to be lip service to something as opposed to like understanding kind of the more foundational stuff, and let the businesses do take responsibility, I guess, for that in a certain degree.
Right. Well, and I think, as anyone who's worked in software engineering or had exposure to it knows, right? You can have very securely written code that functionally is very flawed, right? Giving users excessive permissions, allowing, password resets and things. All of those CWE kind of design weaknesses are by and large not going to get fixed because you're using a secure coding language, right? So you need to have secure architecture and design along with secure coding to really have a secure product.
All right, and our last story today, cyber attack hits major U.S. water utility. American Water Works, which serves over 14 million people in New Jersey, disclosed a cyber attack that impacted its billing system, though the company says the water and wastewater services remain unaffected. The attack was first detected on October 3rd, and the company had assured customers that there will be no late fees or service interruptions as they work to restore normal operations. In response to the growing number of threats aimed at the water sector, the EPA announced plans to ramp up security inspections and require the government to provide yearly risk updates. So, Quincy, I guess we're back to the mold problem here, not just because it deals with water, but it's nice that American Water Works is not going to turn off the taps for customers who can't get through to the billing department. I guess the deeper problem goes back to the salt typhoon issue. The billing system isn't connected to the water management system until someone discovers that it is. You can replace American Water Works with any utility anywhere in the country and have the same concerns. I'm curious, just real quick, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, this is just the classic, OT security kind of problem, right? The more people use technology to take advantage of cost optimization, predictive maintenance, all of those things that are cool to go do on industrial systems, the more risk you open up. And it is not surprising to me that people would have connectivity in an environment like this that they weren't aware of, either because they've got third-party vendors and they're installing their own stuff, they've got people who just are careless on what they're doing, or they don't have good documentation, or people are just not really comprehending the implications of the changes that they're making within the environment. But again, I think this goes back to these larger issues of government policy and regulatory regimes, and how do we incentivize secure behavior on the part of the private sector in the United States? And I think there's a lot of scenarios like this where, is anyone really gonna face any consequences for this? Probably not. And in these kinds of environments where you have these, kind of regional players and, maybe low margin industrial businesses and things like that, you combine that with a really fragmented regulatory regime where you have, well, I mean, just the very fact that we have the EPA getting involved in cybersecurity when we already have, an alphabet soup of other government agencies that also cover this stuff. How are small organizations supposed to understand what they're supposed to do in that context? So we really need leadership and clarity at a policy level to help get this right.
I like that that's the overall theme of today's episode, is create the right incentives for what you actually want, not just, hey, a checkbox, we wrote it in Rust, congratulations, everything's safe now. Yeah, we saved the internet.
It'd be a good time to plug that I also have a non-traditional background as an econ major. So, I'm very big on what are the incentives that get people to do the things you want them to do.
I like anyone that comes from the social sciences in cybersecurity. We need economists and anthropologists, more of them, please.
Yes.
We could leave the sociologists out. Just kidding, sociologists. We love you too. All right. Well, thanks to everybody that was commenting today. CCL had one quick question here. Is internet routing really impacted by memory safety? I thought issues were more from misconfigurations.
No, totally separate topics.
Okay. They just kind of lumped those together in the announcement.
Yeah.
All right, cool. And then, but we had some great stuff from MR, from CCL, like I was saying, from a cat, from the big boss man, David Spark himself. I think I saw Kevin Farrell in there, David Cross. So thanks to everybody that was contributing in our chat. Really appreciate it. Before we get out of here, Quincy, was there any story that was a thumbs up or an eye roller for you, either in our rundown or just kind of in the news of the week this week?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, we've been talking about policy the whole time. I really think that is something that doesn't get enough attention. And I love to see some of these overlapping initiatives that are trying to drive better incentives on the part of the private sector. As always, having intelligent people in policymaking decisions who understand these topics is super important. And I love to see evidence or not that that's going on. So,
and I just want to give a shout out to our producer, Steve Prentice, who always puts together such a fantastic rundown to put these breadcrumbs for us to discuss together. I know it's important to have these in the news, but I love that Steve is a policy nerd like me and likes to get into the details on this. So this is really fantastic. Well, Quincy Castro, the CISO over at Redis, thank you so much. As you can tell, I could do this all day. This was just a pleasure. Where can people find you on the cyberspace if they want to keep up with what you're up to?
Yeah, come hit me up on LinkedIn. I think I'm Quincy-Castro. Love to chat with you there.
And is Redis hiring right now?
We are, yes. We just announced an opening for summer interns next year for undergraduate engineering interns. And we also have a role open for a risk analyst on the team right now.
Fantastic. So check those out as well. We'll have a link to that in our show notes. Thanks also to our sponsor for this week, Vanta, compliance that doesn't suck too much. And again, thanks to all of our everybody in our audience today. Really appreciate having everybody here. Couldn't get everything up on screen that was coming in. Some deep conversations going on, but we really appreciate everybody being here. And make sure you come back next week because we got a whole big Friday of fun happening here with the CISO series. It starts out with Super Cyber Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, where the topic will be hacking the hype of zero trust, an hour of critical thinking about what are the identity and access functions that are helping us achieve the security nirvana. And you can then join us at 3:30 p.m. Eastern for another episode of the Weekend Review. If you want to find details about all that, CISOseries.com/events. And you can still get your daily news fix every single day through cybersecurity headlines. Give us about 6 minutes. We'll get you all caught up. From myself, from everyone here at the CISO Series team, and for Quincy, I'm going to even say, I'm Rich Stroffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOseries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.